Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the very important topics that Max Scheler introduces in part one of his work, Ressentiment, which ties in with his larger work, is what he calls value, blindness, and delusion, and how they figure in centrally to this dynamic of ressentiment. And I'm going to bring in something quite outside of this work, and it's quite a massive tome. So you're going to notice him talking about things like hierarchy of values, and value, feeling, and perception, and all that. And this is coming from his master work, Formalism in Ethics and Non-Formal Ethics of Values, which is, of course, a translation of his Formalismus in Ethik. So there's a lot that's going on here that is referencing his larger work, and we're not going to get too deep into that, but I do want to give you a little bit of background information that occurs a little bit later in part one than where he's talking about this value delusion of ressentiment. So he is going to mention the centrality of values. And we're going to see him, bringing this up in a lot of different ways. He's going to bring in a number of different terms that are quite important here as well. So this is a little bit later on when he's talking about moral systems. He tells us that Nietzsche is wrong in thinking that genuine morality springs from ressentiment. This is one place where Scheler differs from him. It rests, he says, on an eternal hierarchy of values, and its rules of preference are fully as objective and clearly evident as mathematical truths. There does exist an ordre du cœur, an order of the heart, and a logique du cœur, a logic of the heart or reason of the heart in Pascal's words, which the moral genius gradually uncovers in history, and it is eternal. Only its apprehension and acquisition is historical. Ressentiment helps to subvert this eternal order in man's consciousness, to falsify its recognition, and to deflect its actualization. So that is Scheler telling us about why we end up with value delusions. This is sort of the big picture of it. And again, it's treated in his much larger work. So he is going to talk about as he calls it, a specific value delusion of ressentiment. And he's going to point out two parts to it. So this is in the discussion of comparison, and he's going to reference an illusory devaluation or blindness in relation to others' qualities. So, for example, I see somebody who has a beautiful body. I don't have a beautiful body, and I feel kind of bad about the fact that, my body is now old and out of shape and wrinkly and fat and stuff like that. And I see theirs, and I get some sour grapes, and I say, well, they're not that attractive. What's really attractive is inner beauty or something like that. I don't recognize the value, which would be among what Scheler calls the vital values. It's not as if that's like the be-all and end-all. That's not the holy. That's not spiritual values. But it is something that has to do with good-looking bodies, right? And I have to pretend like it's not really that great. Or I have to pretend that it doesn't even exist. Similarly, I could have envy of my colleagues who are smarter and more articulate than me in explaining Max Scheler or Hegel or the Stoics or Aristotle, and I could try to pull them down to my level and say, well, they're not really that hot stuff that everybody thinks that they are. I don't know why everyone reads them instead of reading my stuff, which is just as good. If my stuff isn't as good, then it doesn't have the same value, the same spiritual value as theirs does. And so I can deform it, I can devalue it, or I can be blind to it in that specific instance. However, there's a more general tendency involved here, and he tells us this is the main achievement of Ressentiment. So this is what Ressentiment does. He falsifies the values themselves, which could bestow excellence on any possible objects of comparison. So the values more generally, one is going to say, well, that's not really that valuable. You pull it from a higher point in the hierarchy to a lower point. What can you purchase with that brilliant mind stuff of yours? It's not good for anything. What pleasure are you giving to somebody? These are lower values for Scheler, right, within the objective hierarchy of values. So people who are filled with ressentiment don't just target individuals. It becomes a general way of looking at the world. And so he goes on and he says, we must discuss one general aspect of the philosophical problem of value, which is extremely important for understanding the ressentiment delusion. And what is this? It is the relation between what he calls value consciousness, the being conscious of a value in some thing or person or action or a set of arrangements, and our desires. Now, desire is being used in a way that includes not just desire, but also its opposite, aversion, as well. And we can talk about anti-values or negative values just as much as we can talk about positive ones. So he goes on and he says that a good example of this is Spinoza. Good in Spinoza's view means to be desired, right? Or when there happens to be no desire at the moment, to be capable of inciting desire. And he goes on and says, so according to this theory, aspiration, that is moving towards something, and aversion are not founded on any preceding value consciousness. On the contrary, it's turned the other way. Value consciousness is only the realization that we desire the object or we could desire it. And he says, I have refuted these theories elsewhere. Where has he refuted these theories? In his big, thick book, right? So he's not going to treat that. And he says, what we're really interested in here is the fact that this kind of theory, which, could be Spinoza, could be Hobbes. Spinoza actually kind of gets that from Hobbes. Could be others along the same lines. What interests us here is that the theory is a product, but also a description of ressentiment. Every aspiration, he says, clearly contains a value consciousness on which it is founded. So if we're being more realistic about this, kind of pun intended, if you've ever read Scheler, he says that it appears in the way in which we feel the values in question, the act of preferring. But we can end up having value blindness or delusion when we feel unable to attain certain values. And again, he's going to use this metaphor of sour grapes later on. It's sort of like saying, well, I can't have that, so it's no good. Because my desires are frustrated, cannot be satisfied, it's all crap. It's not as good as people pretend it to be. So he goes on and he says, this takes the form of lowering values to the level of one's desire or one's ability. And he says this should not be confused with a conscious act of resignation. Now, let's pause for a moment. Why should this not be confused with the conscious act of resignation? Because in resigning ourselves, we're not doing it out of ressentiment. If you're really resigned to something, then you're okay with it. You're fine with saying, well, that's not for me, but it's still a good thing. Or, oh, I can't get away from this, and it's still a bad thing. I don't have to deny it. So he tells us that lowering all the values to the levels of one's own factual desire or ability, construing an illusory hierarchy of values in accordance with the structure of one's personal goals and wishes, that's not the way a normal and meaningful value consciousness is realized. It is, on the contrary, a source of value blindness. This is how we screw ourselves up. And he says that this creates value delusions and illusions. But resignation proves a thing can be appreciated even when it lies beyond one's reach. So, if the awareness of our limitations begins to limit, he says, or dim our value consciousness as well, for example, old age, older people are like, yeah, I realize that I can't enjoy what those young people did, but that's because those young people are stupid. Those aren't real values. Feeling healthy, engaging in a lot of study. What good is all of that? That's ressentiment talking. And it's not just sniping out of envy. It's literally confusing oneself, becoming blind, becoming deluded about what actually has values. And he says, resignation will actually deliver us from this. So this is definitely not resignation. He goes on and he talks about slandering the unattainable values. Now, does this actually work 100%? No. Because when somebody does slander or denigrate or devalue these values, it doesn't mean that the awareness of them is completely gone, he says. They're by no means completely unaware of their positive character. It's not as if they simply did not exist in his experience. In that case, we could not speak of a delusion. To be deluded means that you partly know the truth, but you're hiding it from yourself. He also goes on and he says, nor can we say that he feels these values, but he contradicts his experience by false judgments. That would be either error or mendacity. Mendacity means lying to oneself. So what's going on instead? He tells us the phenomenal peculiarity of the ressentiment delusion can be described as follows. So when a phenomenologist says, I'm going to describe something, that means that he's telling you about the essential structures of it, the way that he or she thinks that it is in fact set up. So Scheler tells us this: the positive values are felt as such, but, he uses a metaphor here, they are overcast by the false values and can shine through only dimly. So you've got the true values in the background shedding light, but they're covered with a film. There's a refraction, a distortion that is going on in our perception of them if we are being moved by ressentiment into value blindness or delusion. So they are still shining through dimly, but they can't shine through as such, and that's how we can get confused about them. So he says the ressentiment experience is always characterized by this transparent presence of the true and objective values behind the illusory ones, this obscure awareness, and I love this phrase, obscure awareness that one lives in a sham world which one is unable to penetrate. Which goes to show you that ressentiment as what we might call a compensatory or coping mechanism is only partly successful. If you do have a sense that the world isn't the way it ought to be, that it's kind of a sham, is that a good way to live? Is that a healthy and enjoyable way to live? Is that satisfying? No, the person who is living in ressentiment can never truly be happy with the world, with others, or with himself. So, moving on from this, there's something I want to come back to that he mentioned a little bit earlier. He talks about the independence of value consciousness from our wishes and abilities. So there's a non-dependency, right? These are distinct things. And so he tells us that this is proved by the fact that perversions of the desires, such as for food or sex, for example, masochism, do not necessarily taint the sense of values. In the early stages of these perversions, feelings remain normal. So loathsome food, that is hateful food, food that's gross, still arouses loathing despite the impulse to eat it. Only later the feelings gradually follow the impulse. But even then, the sense of values may remain unaffected. So what this means is that there's a difference between perversion of desire. And what is perversion? Going astray, going in a direction that it shouldn't be. So, you could think of masochism, for example. What does the masochist want? The masochist wants to have pain or suffering imposed upon him. That's how they get aroused, and that's how they get off. Now, should that actually be the case? Why is that considered a perversion, or why is the correlative sadism considered to be a perversion? Well, because it takes normal, healthy desire, and somehow things get screwed up, right? And there's all sorts of cases of this. People do this with food, like he points out, sex. People do this with sleeping too much, sleeping too little. Anything that could be a matter of bodily or even non-bodily desires and pleasures or pains could be involved in that, right? That's not the same thing as illusions and delusions of value feeling, as he's going to say. Why is that the case? Because, as Scheler tells us, and again, this is there in his work, Formalism and Non-Formalism and Ethics, feeling or preferring, for Naaman, setting one thing in place of or above another, prioritizing is another way of talking about it. A value is essentially an act of cognition. Now, that might throw you for a loop, because if you're used to thinking about cognition as something that doesn't have any affective qualities to it, doesn't have, feelings, doesn't have ascription of value, if you're one of these people who thinks that fact is one thing and we cognize facts and we feel values, well, then this is going to be, a hard thing for you to read. Scheler is a phenomenologist of value who understands the central importance of affectivity, which, by the way, Plato knew, Aristotle knew, Augustine knew, the Stoics knew. This is not something radically new as a doctrine, but it can be new to some modern readers. So that is part of why perversions of desire are not the same thing and cannot be directly correlated to illusions and delusions of value feeling. So all of this is something that is, you could say, metaphysically and morally involved in the structure of ressentiment. And Scheler is making use of his previous phenomenology of ethics to bring this to light for us. And I think it's quite insightful and useful for us to look at things in this way.